He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Well, there's a lot of angst these days about AI, understandably, given all the misinformation it can amplify and the fake stuff it can generate, even highly convincing deepfakes. Our newsrooms are using it in ways that aren't often obvious to us when we consume the news. And because we know that trust in the news is important, that matters. Our media say, trust us, we have policies in place and we know what we're doing with AI. But what are they doing with it? Well, the first formal survey of that here was out this week from the AUT, and we'll hear from the author of that. And we also asked the first director of AI strategy here at RNZ, what is the strategy for AI at RNZ?
The red line that RNZ draws is that generative AI tools shouldn't be used to create content in whole or in part that is going to be broadcast or published.
But first this week, another new survey that was out this week asked New Zealanders what words on air bother us, and it finds we're still a bit sensitive about some bad language.
Kiwis are less keen to hear offensive language in broadcasting. A BSA survey's found more than half of the words assessed are now seen as less acceptable in broadcasting than they were 4 years ago. The N word and the C word were considered unacceptable by the highest percentage of people.
That was News Talk ZB News on Tuesday afternoon, the day the Broadcasting Standards Authority issued its latest survey of New Zealand's attitudes to offensive language on the air, what not to swear, as it's sometimes known. And shortly before that, on ZB's Drive Show, the host Heather Duplessis-Allen had told her listeners this.
According to the report, Kiwis are actually becoming less tolerant of bad language in broadcasts, which goes against the trend of the last few surveys.
Well, the BSA's media release did say New Zealanders' tolerance for offensive language in broadcasting has fallen in the 4 years since the last one in 2021, partly reversing what the BSA said was a long-term trend of softening attitudes over the previous 20 years. But on ZB Drive, the AUT communications teacher Lewis Tennant told Heather Duplessis-Allen we're not really much more miffed about bad language in general on the air these days, but more of us are maybe marginally more miffed by the offensive terms that are used to single certain people out.
You could say we're more intolerant, but it's actually more intolerance overall for racial slurs and kind of loaded gendered language. But the long-term trend for kind of naughty words is still much more relaxed overall.
And on RNZ's Nights show the same day, the boss of the BSA, Stacey Wood, said we are still softening towards words that were once considered obscene just for the sake of it.
I think a lot of people are pretty immune to the F word now in a lot of contexts, but there's still words that you might say around your mates or when you stub your toe that you wouldn't say in front of your nana. So it's always, it comes back to context again.
Fair enough, but some nanas are not so easily offended, and when the context is broadcasting or the mainstream media, certain words can still shock. On Tuesday's ZB Drive show, Heather Duplessis-Allen cited the Post's National Affairs editor Andrea Vance in an emotional column that condemned the government's sudden reversal of pay equity agreements last year, firing the C word at female ministers, one of whom then repeated it for effect in Parliament. And that had the effect of leading the 6 o'clock TV news on Channel 3.
No mai haere mai, welcome to 3 News. To see or not to see? That was the question for Parliament when Workplace Relations Minister Brooke Van Velden chose to use the C word in full today during a fiery debate in the House.
But that C-bomb was very much the exception to the media rule on those very offensive words, and Stuff said the use of it was very deliberate to make an important political point. Now, coincidentally, on the same show that day, ZB's Heather Duplessis-Allen also deployed some language to make a political point herself that was, if not really offensive, then certainly a bit loaded. She opened her show, as is customary, with an on-air editorial intended to attract feedback, and on Tuesday she picked for this the Labour Party's joint media conference with the Greens earlier that day. Now that was designed to demonstrate unity in election year between the parties, but it was derailed almost immediately by news of Pini Henare's retirement as an MP, prompting leader Chris Hipkins to grizzle about the media.
And I'll comment after that.
He's already made it. He's already made it out in public.
Well, if media outlets have breached the embargo, then that's their call.
That's his call. He's doing interviews.
Well, I understand he did some pre-recorded interviews in advance under embargo. If media outlets have broken the embargo, that's a question for them.
But while Heather Duplessis-Allen on ZB reckoned it was Hipkins and Labour who made a mess of that media conference, her main point was this.
But doing a press conference with the Greens seems not just like a waste of time, but maybe actually an unfortunate reminder to us all, really, that a Chippy-led government comes with green-coloured baggage.
And half an hour later, after that chat about offensive language on the air, ZB's veteran political reporter Barry Soper agreed with his real-life wife that the Labour Greens press conference was desperate.
Looks
yes,
desperate.
it is. I mean, talk about Chippy declaring his hand. He's got no comeback from this. So the Greens are on board. Look at their loopy policies and think about what a coalition would look like with that.
Never mind their staffing issues,
well,
like Golly the Thief.
Yes, yeah,
for
exactly.
example.
Now, Barry Soper didn't specify which Greens policies were loopy, and it was an interesting word to choose. Before the last election in 2023, Barry Soper and Heather Duplessis-Allen were sanctioned for a similar conversation on the same show, in which Soper called the Greens policies loony and said you'd have to be on the spectrum to vote for Te Pāti Māori. Not only was that fairly dismissive to the 1 in 7 voters who ended up backing those two parties in the general election, but it was also offensive to those with autism spectrum disorder. ZB's owner NZME itself upheld a complaint citing the broadcasting standard for discrimination and denigration. They said Barry Soper and Heather Duplessis-Allen had both been counselled on the potential offence and impact of such comments, but the BSA was satisfied in the end that NZME had acknowledged the effect of reinforcing harmful stereotypes and counselled its staff to avoid similar conduct. But this week, Heather Duplessis-Allen didn't hold back on her personal opinion of the Greens either, in pretty personal terms in her scripted editorial.
The Greens aren't exactly the image of internal discipline, are they? What with Golriz the thief and Bussy the awkward parent, Darlene the questionable employer, the spate of staffer resignations, and that's not even mentioning the electorally toxic plans to tax us all into poverty.
Golriz Garaman, Benjamin Doyle and Darlene Tana are now, of course, all former Green MPs who aren't even standing for election this year. And while Doyle's adoption of Bussy in a personal social media account was controversial, calling him an awkward parent on national radio is a tough one to justify. Later on Tuesday, Green co-leader Chloe Swarbrick was on the same show, and she was given a fair hearing by Heather Duplessis-Allen and reasonable questions about that media conference, the Labour Party, Te Pāti Māori and election year. And Heather Duplessis-Allen even thanked Swarbrick at the end for showing up when the leader of the Labour Party hadn't. It seems there's one approach taken when politicians are on the line and able to respond, and another when they're not. So in election year, will there be a similar sort of shift in public mood about pejorative political opinions, similar to the one the BSA found when it comes to abusive and aggressive offensive language? Talking about that on ZB last Tuesday, Heather Duplessis-Allen also asked the AUT's Lewis Tennant this question.
Do you ever foresee a world where we do actually say the F word or the C word on air and no one even cares?
Well, that's kind of coming back to online content. Like, we hear it all the time. I think it's all about intent again. Like, the way it was used in that article was really aggressive. But no, I can't see a world where you're dropping C-bombs every second voice break in the next foreseeable future.
We're all happy about that.
Interestingly, Lewis Tennant reckoned that it might just be the increasing coarseness of the internet these days that's lifting people's expectations of greater decency in the mainstream media.
It's people recognising that broadcast TV and broadcast radio are kind of the last bastion of being able to safely have your kids around or your granny around and not be kind of hit with something you're not expecting. So in other words, I wonder whether there's a kind of an internet fatigue setting in. We all know we kind of see and hear everything there, and it's kind of lawless in terms of legislation. So I wonder whether that's where that trend's changed a bit, where people are getting a bit...
Yeah, you know that you can turn the radio on in the car and generally you can have the kids in there and you know, nothing bad is going to be said. That's a fair point.
But maybe you can't always be assured of that. Lewis Tennant has a podcast about things going wrong in New Zealand called Oopsie, and last week's edition of RNZ National's weekly political panel, The Whip, had one of those when teeing up a quiz question about the former Prime Minister Bill English and his now notorious tin spaghetti pizza.
And here it is. So former Prime Minister Bill English made what food dish that was so infamous it went round the world? This is UK comedian John Oliver reacting to Bill English's recipe.
Moving on to a quick update regarding New Zealand. Wallaby Island.
Okay, so that was not the right clip. Am I correct? Is that right? Okay, so, all right, disregard that, and we really apologise for that language there.
Well, that was the wrong bit of John Oliver mocking New Zealand for something else back in 2017. Clearly, bad language standards on US cable TV channels don't quite align with RNZ standards today, or our broadcasting standards, or even public opinion, as illustrated in the latest survey. Now, on the topic of offensive content that needs special handling, millions more documents in the so-called Epstein files have been making headlines all around the world day after day, and there's much more of it to come. Now, some say the sordid stuff that's piling up is really going nowhere, while others say it's the new Watergate. So, is it? Last Wednesday, I talked about that on Midweek Mediawatch, our weekly catch-up with Nights here on RNZ National, with Emile Donovan. And we also looked at the Prime Minister being on the wrong end of an offensive gesture that ended up in the news, and the bizarre and billionaire-backed movie about Melania Trump. Also, another New Zealand radio company has changed hands, sort of, ending up in the hands of an Aussie media company that, ironically, seems to want out of radio and New Zealand media. All that and more in this week's Midweek Media Watch. If you missed it, it's available on our podcast page at rnz.co.nz or in our podcast feed, available wherever you get your podcasts. About a year and a half ago, Mediawatch sparked a minor media controversy when we revealed that the New Zealand Herald had used AI to write some editorials, with readers none the wiser that it was technology turning out what was supposed to be the Herald's own position on a topical issue. Now, that came to light in the first place because a couple of clunkily written editorials about sport in the Weekend Herald didn't look quite right. They repeated key phrases and also paraphrased previous original reporting by the Herald's own human sports writers. Now, the Herald eventually admitted that there was insufficient human oversight in these cases, but its actual editorial policy, they said, made it clear that the Herald would not shy away from using new technology tools to streamline Herald content and presentation, so long as human journalists were in the loop and calling the shots. Now, their big rivals in digital news and newspaper publishing, Stuff, had a more transparent AI policy at that time. Back then, it said that every use of AI would be declared to its readers, even which tools had been used and how. But some of the first uses flagged to the readers didn't impress them much. Oh no, turns out AI sucks at writing, said the spin-off, when Stuff used the AI tool ChatGPT to write a story based on their readers' feedback. The clunky headline, Stuff poll says Christchurch is New Zealand's best place, New Plymouth not happy about it, presumably made sense to the robot that wrote it. But since then, Stuff has dumped the Declare All AI to Enhance Trust policy, and Stuff's use of generative AI for journalism has become much more sophisticated behind the scenes. For example, Stuff has used AI for basic breaking news online from reliable sources like the emergency services, and it's deployed AI chatbots for last year's budget to answer readers' questions about it. And soon after, Stuff won the Best Use of AI prize at the International News Media Association Awards. That was for Democracy AI, a tool to summarise information from local body documents which might otherwise be only seen by a few people. Now, the Herald has been innovating too, using AI to create summaries and edited versions of its online stories, and it also synthesised the voice of newsreader Susie Nordquist so that website readers can also hear the stories read out.
And PR leaders have their say. News publisher Stuff has defended one of its top journalists directing the C word in a published column at Finance Minister Nicola Willis and other female coalition government ministers. But those who were targeted and some other politicians...
Well, here at RNZ, the policy is still not to generate original content with generative AI, but we can use tools to help out with design and grunt work like transcription, but only with human direction and oversight. But RNZ's series Narc went further than that last year.
With the blessing and consent of his family, I used Radio Pacific interviews Ross had done to teach AI his voice patterns and then applied that to his own words.
I was aware Tahira was in for a bashing because the word was that he had done a rip-off and he was going to get a bashing, but nothing more than that.
It's fair to say, at the start, it was a bit hit and miss. That Kiwi accent took some finessing to nail. But in the end, it got there. A dead man's words just the way he'd say them. Or as good as.
But in other countries, media are far further ahead with AI technology. The world's biggest broadcaster, the BBC, also uses AI heavily now, sometimes in ways you might not expect. For example, last year, the BBC's visiting AI director Laura Ellis told me that BBC documentaries have deep-faked faces for people who wish to remain anonymous.
But we are very careful to disclose it. And in one of the most recent examples that we...
So instead of pixelating, you put someone else's face on, so it looks a bit better for the audience.
It does, because you can see them actually respond and actually...
And you tell the audience, we have disguised...
We do.
Wow, okay.
We do, and we tell them, I mean, the best example one of the most recent examples that we used this on was an Alcoholics Anonymous programme. So people wanted to be anonymous, but they also wanted to have their stories told. And we put it in the script, as well as putting something on screen. So one of the interviewees actually said, my face doesn't matter, what I look like doesn't matter, but what matters is, the story that I'm telling you. So we were very, very clear that these were face swaps, these were kind of deepfake faces, but that we were using them for a reason.
But isn't that really like using an actor, and would the audience respond a little differently to an individual on screen with a faked face? Well, we'll gradually get more used to it, Laura Ellis told me last year. But the BBC has also complained bitterly about its own stuff being ripped off and misrepresented by others using AI badly. In fact, the same week that Laura Ellis was here, the BBC's Director General pledged to make the BBC a centre of AI excellence unmatched in Western Europe. But recently, Tim Davies had to quit the BBC over the dodgy editing of Donald Trump in that documentary. Now, that breach of standards was nothing to do with the use of AI, but ironically, some experts said that AI might have picked up that problem before the program had ever even aired in the UK. Now, that would have been good, but survey after survey here has found New Zealanders are still sceptical about AI and how it's used by the media. And with the volume of AI slop out there, you can't blame them. Likewise, the errors that AI tools make that can embarrass our newsrooms. For example, just after Christmas, the Herald publisher NZME apologised after several of its regional newspapers published a Kiwi children's book list just before Christmas that included several books by New Zealand authors, which didn't exist. NZME apologised for that and explained like this.
We recently published a list of book titles provided by the World Literacy Foundation that contained several inaccuracies. We have raised this with the Foundation. They have apologised and they're reviewing their internal processes.
Now, it's highly likely those processes included using AI as a shortcut to compile that list. And AI also plays a role in presenting the stories to us. Last year, the Herald began using AI to curate almost all of its website homepage. Just 3 spots for news items were customarily selected by human editors. The idea was to reflect readers' own interests and engagement with Herald content and maximise the appeal to them individually in a way that no human editor could. But the all-important Nielsen readership stats have showed that the Herald site's readership has fallen behind its rival Stuff, whose homepage and main news section is still human-curated. Well, there could be other reasons for that, of course, and most readers probably don't know that AI is even in play. But while media companies want us to trust them to use AI ethically, how do we know they're using it? This week, the AUT's Centre for Journalism, Media and Democracy published its first report on artificial intelligence in journalism in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and suggests some key policy changes. So which ones? I asked the author, Dr. Meria Milanati, an associate professor at the AUT's Screen, Audio and Journalism Department. And also in the conversation, RNZ's first AI Director of Strategy and Implementation, Patrick Crudson. He was consulted for the new report and was formerly a senior editor at Stuff, where AI, as we've heard, is now part of the furniture. Well, I'll start with you, Meria. I mean, in your report, you say AI tools are widely used now in day-to-day news and content production here. Commercial media outlets, Stuff and NZME, are experimenting more widely than the public broadcasters, RNZ and TVNZ. Does that mirror the pattern you might expect in other countries? Is that characteristic?
Yeah, it's pretty much a similar kind of pattern. There was a recent study by Reuters in the UK, and it was the commercial and independents were using some integrated tools more than the public media. So I think it is a similar kind of pattern.
And Patrick, is there any reason that a public broadcaster like RNZ should be more hands-off or more cautious than a commercial media company?
Obviously, being profit-driven. They are going to be very assertive about pursuing new opportunities. And then it's also natural that public service agencies are going to be not necessarily more circumspect, but definitely more deliberate and considered about their approach. In New Zealand, the public broadcasters are starting to move faster now. RNZ appointed me into this role, and I see that this week TVNZ is advertising a number of AI and data-specific roles.
So your job title, I think, is Director of AI Strategy and Implementation?
That's right.
So what is RNZ's strategy and policy in a nutshell?
So RNZ's strategy is still developing around AI. RNZ has a published set of principles that govern how it approaches AI at the moment, and it's about transparency and oversight, prioritising talent and creativity, and being really mindful about security and privacy, RNZ's other policies and the law, and most importantly, how we serve the public interest. I think RNZ will be more conservative about the use of generative AI to generate content than commercial media outlets will. And I think over time, I wouldn't be surprised to see commercial media outlets taking a more AI everywhere sort of approach. So the red line that RNZ draws is that generative AI tools shouldn't be used to create content in whole or in part that is going to be broadcast or published. AI will be used for processes and production assistance, like transcriptions, and will be used for research to improve the quality of word processing, other more mundane tasks, and those will be common in newsrooms everywhere.
Actually, Miria, in the Post this week, Tom Polistreka, the Stuff journalist, wrote about your report, and he wrote that journalists these days have more kind of autonomy than they used to be. It used to be more regimented when things were based around newspaper production and daily deadlines and things like that. Do you find that journalists might be using things in ways that their colleagues aren't, or even that their editors don't even know about?
Of course, journalists are working independently, more independently. I have no doubts about that. But where's then that control, the editorial control, and the control for that, how they've been used? And so are the journalists actually declaring them for editors, for example? For me, that kind of signals that are these controls really fully in place? To me, it's great that these companies or any company who's using this technology is having these ethical principles and the reports and goals and practice. But what they don't have is then kind of real transparency or telling the audiences that how they really use them. In terms of that Post article by Tom Polistreka, I think it was excellent because he was actually telling the audiences how he's using them. Pretty honest. I think I really like that.
One of the points that I was interested in from Miria's report is transparency. What transparency measures does Miria think would be appropriate?
Yeah, I don't think that every single piece or article or whatever should have that label or tag that this is AI has been used this and this way. But when I'm talking about transparency, it's about telling the public that how you use these tools. So, for example, there's nothing on the home pages of the news sites saying that, okay, our journalists are using this for research, they're using for this transcription, we create summaries. They are hidden, these ethics and principles are hidden in some editorial policies or the sites where the public don't go. So transparency to me is more about almost like a media literacy kind of approach that, here is how we're using it. So more you tell about the audience, the better it is. And that's what I mean with the transparency, if that makes sense.
Sure. I mean, in your report, it does say news organisations don't disclose exactly how AI is used in content production, and some editors feel, quotes, that ship has sailed in terms of tagging or labelling AI content. Do you, Miria, feel that is editors kind of thinking, actually, the public doesn't care that much, and and even if we did tag it, that still wouldn't help them understand how we'd used it, that it's just not necessary anymore?
No, I think the ship has sailed kind of comment was in terms of we don't have to tell about how we're using certain tools. So, as I said, it doesn't mean that, you label every single piece of content that this is AI, was used this way. But it's more general kind of transparency around it.
Yeah, Stuff originally had a policy that says we will tell you every time, even which tools we're using. So, Patrick, I'm guessing you might have been there at the time when it had that policy, but
I probably helped write that policy. I think we need to be guided by what our audiences want and expect. If content is wholly or partly generated by AI, we should be really clearly disclosing that and being transparent about it. Tools become just part of the normal standard production process, and disclosing them doesn't give the audience any value unless they have somehow materially changed the meaning or the integrity of the content. You know, we don't put in articles, this interview was conducted by telephone. We don't say we used the World Wide Web to search for information on this topic.
Can you think of perhaps an outstanding piece of or advanced use of AI that's going on in New Zealand newsrooms that you're aware of? Perhaps the most advanced use that you can think of?
NARC podcast, that RNZ broadcast, created by Mike Wesley-Smith, where a synthetic voice, a clone of Ross Applegren's voice was used. And quite importantly, I think for the people making the podcast, welcomed by his widow. NZME is also pushing the boat out, and their first look editing tool and the first listen audio tool that Maria mentioned in her report, those both sound interesting.
For sure. What about alarming uses or fails, things that show the pitfalls?
I'm not going to point to anything in New Zealand, but the international examples that we've seen, the most dangerous ones have been where generative AI is used to create content and the usual standards of journalistic rigour aren't applied. So, you know, one of the now classic examples is the American newspaper that generated a summer book reading list.
That was...
Well, that was Chicago a newspaper that did that. I think 10 out of 15 books were not legit or real. That happened here just before Christmas. NZME apologised because some of its regional North Island papers like Hawke's Bay Today, Rotorua Daily Post, published Kids, Kiwi, and several of those, the authors were real, but the books were not. And it turned out that this came from an international outfit, a literacy foundation. They used AI to compile this list, and AI hallucinated those particular titles. Or is that really a lazy journalism problem, that an international outfit supplied a list of Kiwi books that if a New Zealand book expert could have compiled in the traditional way?
I think anyone who's using generative AI tools needs to be really conscious of the risk that they make things up. You know, the process of where it's provided by a trusted partner, and so therefore you don't check it. Well, I guess next time they will.
But in the report it says AI tools widely used by New Zealanders now, but their trust in AI-generated journalism is low. 26% of New Zealanders, I think, is the figure in your report, comfortable with news produced mainly by human journalists with AI assistance, which is there anything you think that can be done to change that figure? Because that's very low.
It is very low, and that is something we need to do. The one thing about the AI news consumption, we publishing our trust survey, hopefully again late April, and we are first time looking at AI consumption and how the people are actually using AI tools or the searches and assistance for consuming the news. So I hope I have some more information around that in a couple of months' time.
Well, Patrick, does that worry you? I mean, that figure, 26%.
The research I've seen shows that if you give people images or text, some of which are AI generated and some of which are human generated, and ask them to rate the quality and rate how much they trust them, if they don't know which one's which, they'll rate them pretty much equally. Once they know that one of them is AI generated, then they downweight that. They like that less, trust it less. Basically, how asking the question changes someone's response.
Yeah. Do you want a robot to write your news? People are probably going to say no.
Do they trust the result, but then once they know how it's made, they trust it less? And so I think those things will change over time as people become more comfortable with using these tools themselves, and as long as media organisations still uphold their standards and ethical principles.
Laser eye surgery. You asked someone about that maybe 30 years ago and the technology was developing and they'd panic and say, no, I don't want any robot near my eyes. But these days, a lot of people wouldn't blink.
I think, Yeah, that's a good one, Colin. But I think when this technology still is new in terms of news usage or using in news reporting, I think the more transparency you have and more you tell about it to the people, your audiences, readers, listeners, better it is.
Hey, Mary, also the report in its final part notes or has a look at regulation and policy, things that might need to change. And it makes the point that the government here, previous one too, hasn't really been inclined to intervene in areas of technology and media, things like the Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill, all the stuff. The only thing really that the government's given clear signals about is its intentions on a social media ban for under 16s, and that's about it. Do you think this is an area where government or regulators actually need to get involved, or do we just leave it to media companies to form their policy and try and take the public with them about using this technology?
I'm super worried about the copyright of the individual content creators, and basically by the law, New Zealand law, they are protected by the copyright. But of course, these the AI companies. They use all the data, they use that content to train their models, they don't pay anything. And it's the same for the news content or journalistic work, or whether it's in Substack or whether it's on a Radio New Zealand website. This government is ignoring that, I don't understand why we're not using it, because we have an existing law which could be used.
What do you think, Patrick? Because in other countries, maybe in this one too, there are licensing agreements. Media companies have said to the likes of OpenAI, okay, pay us and you can use our data to inform your large language models, and they've done deals like that. There are also things like AI companies are crawling over websites to try and harvest the data. They can take payment that way or prevent that crawling from happening. Things like that. Are those solutions that will ensure that there might be some revenue from big AI companies for the likes of news media producing useful information?
I think that those deals that you're mentioning that have been made overseas, they tend to be between a big tech company, Google, Meta, OpenAI, and a large publisher or broadcaster, often heavily weighted towards the US. They tend to be bilateral deals, just one-on-one between big tech and that publisher. That's quite a convenient setup for those AI companies. There's a power imbalance there, and those agreements are far more convenient to the big tech companies, the AI companies, than they are to the media sector.
Right.
And so I think we have to look at what is in the public interest.
The Australian example that they use that exemption, or they didn't give the AI companies an exemption from a copyright law, so which means that they are mandated to pay for the copyright. So why don't we learn from the past? So we're going round and round in circles, and we're going backwards.
Well, successive governments seem to have saying we'll see what they do in Australia, and then not actually adopting. But has it been effective in Australia? Is that something the government really should?
Well, this is really new. So they did that in December. But there are ways to do that. Yeah, I'm really wary about those individual contracts. When they run out, the money runs out, and then you're left with nothing again. Seeing
as you've written about this in your book, From Paper to Platform, about the dominance and influence of these big platforms like the likes of Facebook, search and social, were you interested to see Facebook or Meta's head of safety here in New Zealand attending events and giving media interviews, because they're now worried about the prospect of Instagram and so on being locked off for under 16s here?
Well, that's a typical thing what they do. That's they have done that all the way to avoid any regulation, or it's a PR kind of campaign, and just trying to avoid the regulation. They have done throughout their history. I think I'm not surprised.
But kind of nice to see a senior Meta executive actually in New Zealand and actually talking to a series of media outlets this week about the issue, because it's very, very difficult to get those companies to comment here in New Zealand anyhow.
They don't talk to you. They don't normally comment. But I think that it would have been really cool to actually to ask them as well that are you going to pay for copyrights here?
That was Dr. Merja Mililahti from the AUT's Centre for Journalism, Media and Democracy, the author of its first report on artificial intelligence in journalism in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we also heard there from RNZ's own Director of AI Strategy and Implementation, Patrick Crewdson. That's it for this week. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediaWatchNZ on X. And you can even write us a letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. Catch you again for Midweek Media Watch next Wednesday. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.